let me first of all say how delighted we are to be actually launching the book, because Ankhi says for COVID reasons, she hasn't managed to have a proper launch in person yet. So we're delighted that we've got the launch. And I don't really need to introduce Ankhi. She is very well known to everybody here, but also well outside Wadham. We are very proud of our Professor of English and World Literature. And she's also well known to generations of Wadham students for her wonderful teaching. And as you can see from the number of people on the line from many countries, how much affection she is held in. I'm not going to say anything about the book, except that I spent the weekend reading it. It is really a wonderful, wonderful read, even for a non-expert, a fascinating breadth, which we're going to explore in the next half hour. But I'm really delighted to welcome two close friends of Ankhi's. First of all, Dr. David Russell, who is fellow and tutor in English at Corpus here in Oxford. He has fairly recently, 2 years ago, I think, published a book called, with the wonderful title actually, of Tact, on essays, the essay form in 19th century British literature, and is working on another book at the moment. I'm sure he'll say a little bit more about that, but covers the Romantic period to the present in his teaching. So we've got an extraordinary spread, because alongside him is our second guest. We're absolutely delighted that we can welcome back Dr. Natalya Din-Kariuki, now at Warwick University. She is an expert on 16th and 17th century literature, so very relevant for Wadham in particular. Has already is working on a book which she may say a little bit about, but is also working on another book on migration, which we were just talking about before we came online, which she might also want to mention. And indeed, David may want to say something about his forthcoming book. So books are a great celebration, but we have one actually here, and that is Ankhi's extraordinary Unseen City, Psychic Lives of the Urban Poor. And the way we thought we would structure this is to ask our two guests to speak for 5 or 10 minutes each, and then for Ankhi to respond. And then, as usual at these events, we'll open it up for everyone for the last sort of 20, 25 minutes. And we promise to stop and let people go on time. So without further ado, let me hand over first to David. Thank you very much for joining us, and over to you, and then we'll hear from Natalya. So thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you, Ankhi, for the chance to celebrate your book. I've got a few remarks, particularly about psychoanalysis, so I'll set off. Reading Ankhi's fascinating book, I was reminded of observation by the 20th century British psychoanalyst, Donald Winnicott, about what it is that Freud, with his invention of psychoanalytic therapy, had really invented. On the one hand, psychoanalysis is famously a technique of interpretation. With the right training, the therapist may analyze the seemingly inconsequential details of a patient's life, the slips of the tongue, their dreams, or inexplicable symptoms, and give them a meaning which would reveal something hidden about the patient's inner self, their personal history, desires, and traumas. By extension, although this was always a more fraught project for Freud, cultures and societies could be analyzed in similar ways, reading the outward signs of the culture for their inward meanings. This model of psychoanalysis as interpreter and patient or culture as subject matter to be interpreted has of course been much critiqued, and for good reason. The scene of interpretation, critics are quick to point out, is often a scene of power by which a set of norms of health and illness, normality and deviancy is imposed by one subject, usually wealthy, white, male, cis, heterosexual subject position, upon another, who may be none of those things, and more broadly by one culture over another. Such is the force of this critique of the power of interpretation by thinkers like Frantz Fanon, who Ankhi writes about in her book, that the idea of applying psychoanalytic thinking across cultures has for some time now seemed at best passé and at worst actively harmful. So it's worth considering the point made by Winnicott, who appears along with an astonishing range of thinkers and voices in Ankhi's book. Winnicott suggested in the 1950s that to focus on psychoanalysis as a practice primarily of interpretation is sometimes to miss the point of what psychoanalysis is for. This is because the invention of psychoanalysis by Freud could be divided into two parts. The first part is the interpretation that I've mentioned. Material presented by the patient, says Winnicott, is understood and interpreted by the analyst. But the second part, says Winnicott, is that what he calls the setting in which the work is carried through. The setting of psychoanalysis, Winnicott remarks, has been more rarely attended to, but it really was quite an innovation on Freud's part, and rather a complex one. Winnicott asks us to consider how revolutionary was Freud's invention of a clinical setting for therapy, which consists of both a place and a time. In other words, a kind of environment in which the analyst meets the patient to talk with them about their life. This environment is unlike others in the world. For in this situation, Winnicott explains, the therapeutic effect of psychoanalysis does not derive only from the analyst having interpretive answers. It derives also from the fact that, to quote Winnicott, the analyst is much more reliable than people are in ordinary life. On the whole, punctual, free from temper tantrums, from compulsive falling in love, etc. So unlike in the world outside, the strangest things can be thought and said in this environment without the person one conveys these thoughts and feelings to becoming too disturbed or taking them too personally. In the psychoanalytic environment, Winnicott explains, quote, the absence of the talion reaction can be counted on. And what he means by this term talion, he's referring to the Old Testament, the principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So he's describing an environment in which there isn't immediately any retribution imposed on someone for the things they think, say, or do. And he describes at least half of what Freud invented as a therapeutic provision of a place and time, maybe just an hour once a week, where people do not have to be afraid of one another in the usual ways. In other words, a world, however small and temporary a world, where there is no retribution. So to put it another way, psychoanalysis reminds us something we need continually to be reminded of, that the environment matters. Now, this is the brilliant proposition at the heart of Unseen City, to place the question of the environment as a psychic fact fully at the heart of an inquiry into modern urban life. In the process, it elegantly evades, without ignoring the familiar critique of psychoanalysis as a method of interpretation, in order to open up in new and fascinating ways the potential of its environmental logics and how they might be rewritten by global therapeutic practices. From its analyses of therapeutic garden projects in London, to the eco-urbanism of characters in Aminata Forna's novels, to the fantasies that attach themselves to the figure of the slum in Mumbai, Unseen City explores how crucial are created environments to the fostering or diminishing of human flourishing. And in the course of its attention to environments, Ankhi's book calls for a new vision. Unseen is an adjective with a usefully indeterminate sense of the active or passive state, connoting both unthinking obliviousness and more determined looking away. The book makes the case that only a wide angle of attention is capable of confronting what has often gone unseen in thinking about mental life in a globalized world. It proposes that any more just vision of what psychoanalysis may have to offer modern times must begin with the very constituencies who have been overlooked, for whom psychotherapy has seemed most irrelevant or unnecessary a luxury, with the most disadvantaged and most overlooked in urban communities. Unseen City is vastly impressive in its wide-ranging attention to urban environments on 3 continents, organized as it is by sections on London, Mumbai, and New York City, and also in its extraordinary range of attention to genre, from novels to films, to fieldwork, to history, to psychogeography, an attention which allows these very different forms and practices to illuminate one another without ever reducing one to the terms of another. Of all its wide range of genres, I'm going to conclude my comment with some remarks about the book's attention in particular to literature. Unseen City approaches a number of novels and essays about what we might loosely call mental health, and which represent the lives of psychiatrists or therapists and those who need the help. In its readings of contemporary authors as diverse as Aminata Forna, Teju Cole, Ravi Haj, Catherine Boo, Unseen City identifies a literary tradition able to question the often too quickly determined relations and boundaries between suffering and trauma, illness and unhappiness, individual and collective psychology. In the process, the book does not stop pointing out the inadequacies of applying Western psychiatry and the psychoanalysis that's all but left behind to different cultures, it proposes the more urgent and creative task of asking what would have to happen to our models of psychological care in order to make them more humane, more just, and more useful to urban populations around the world. Ankhi's book is most fascinating to me when its criticism is able to show that the texts it analyzes are not just about mental health, offering mimetic representation of therapists and sufferers across the world, but also showing us something through their formal qualities. So, for example, we're shown in Catherine Boo's Behind the Beautiful Forevers how paratactic clauses, as they pile up, perform the exceeding of tenacious fantasies held about Mumbai slums and their residents. And in Aminata Fauna's Happiness, how focus on surprising interconnections in the novel are enabled by its own structures of coincidence and narrative form in order to show the disavowed relations between different classes and spaces hidden in contemporary London. Unseen Cities' interleaving of these fictional and journalistic accounts of cities with case histories of therapeutic organizations is highly suggestive. Ankhi's book reminds us that the shared principle of literary criticism and psychoanalysis at their best is a careful listening to the individual case, and only then building up the frameworks of general conclusion. Through its careful excavation of our global present, the book leaves us, to paraphrase Ankhi's description of Fauna's novel, with an approach to questions of justice, which, if not a happy one, is at least hopeful. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. And with apologies, I should have said at the beginning this is being recorded for the benefit of all those who can't make it tonight. But thank you for that introduction. And now I'm going to pass over to Natalya.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for the introduction, Robert, and thank you to Ankhi for the invitation to speak about her wonderful book. So it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be involved in celebrating this brilliant work. The experience of reading Unseen City, in fact, reminded me of what tutorials with Ankhi were like. It's intellectually challenging and exciting. It's able to move deftly from the smallest of textual details to a consideration of the broader cultural and political structures of which those texts and those details are part. Its definition of the literary is expansive. As Ankhi puts her afterword, drawing on Du Bois, the book's understanding of the literary stands for the ability to take a second look. Unseen City is committed to demonstrating the capacity of the humanities to help us to look at the world differently, to make the invisible visible, the unseen seen. By looking at the world differently, Unseen City argues, we can start to transform it. So I want to comment briefly on a few aspects of the book that stood out most to me. One of the most striking things about Unseen City is the ambitiousness of its interdisciplinary approach. In it, Ankhi brings together literature, psychoanalysis, and critical philosophical theorizing, as well as empirical study, psychoanalytic and psychiatric practice, the afterlives of Freud's free clinics. Unseen City ranges from discussions of theorists, including Marx, Judith Butler, and Paul Gilroy, examinations of NGO reports, DSM entries, and case studies, to original interpretations of literature, photography, film, and more. What's striking is not only how elegantly Ankhi navigates this often very dense material, but also how she reveals unexpected and illuminating connections between them, between these seemingly unrelated discourses and texts. Far from simply noting the affinities between literature and psychoanalysis, Ankhi goes further and stages a confrontation between them. She makes use of, as she puts it in her introduction, literature's instrumentality in uncovering and challenging cultural determinants, and in doing so offers an important critique of classical psychoanalysis. In particular, Unseen City reveals the ill fit between the protocols and practices of psychoanalysis and the needs of poor and migrant populations. It offers several examples of case studies revealing that ill fit, where the analyst fails to achieve transference. Often this has to do with language, with the failure of the analyst to communicate properly with those under their analysis. Unseen City also shows the ways in which psychoanalysis is implicated in the neoliberal and imperial mechanisms through which those populations are oppressed. But Ankhi doesn't want us to do away with psychoanalysis altogether. On the contrary, she makes a case for its continued relevance and resonance. If the book puts pressure on psychoanalysis and uncovers its conceptual tensions, and contradictions and social and political shortcomings, it does the same for literature. The book's studies of literary depictions of poverty and mental health help us to see the limits of received ideas about literary genre and form, the ways these ideas might result in distorted representations of poor and migrant people, or erase them altogether. The works of narrative nonfiction studied in this book question, as Ankhi puts it, the social purpose of the novel form, with its generic commitment to class, the redistribution of wealth and justice, and its historical fidelity to equivocal forms of national belonging. Along similar lines, I think, Unseen City interrogates some of the categories we use to taxonomize literature by showing that a category like diaspora fiction, for instance, isn't always able to capture the complexity of the practices and experiences of migration and dispersed populations. In other words, Unseen City shows that the proper description and understanding of the psychic lives of the urban poor requires the reinvention of literary form. His discussion of this formal inventiveness in contemporary literature includes thinking both at the level of genre, as in the critique of the novel form that I mentioned, as well as, in some cases, on the level of syntax, as in her discussion of Catherine Boo's work Behind the Beautiful Forevers, where she considers the significance of Boo's use of parataxis and the connection between this very specific grammatical strategy and the fragmented social structures and psyches that Boo describes. The second aspect of Unseen City that seems especially valuable is its consideration of the ways in which psychoanalysis is embedded in the discourses and practices of colonialism, both in terms of the historical conditions through which psychoanalysis emerged, the colonial and racial implications of its conceptual framework, such as Freud's writing on the primitive and on civilization, and in the ongoing acts of colonial and imperial domination in which it is implicated, including forms of biopowers such as zoning, segregation, and border policing. One of the most hard-hitting parts of the book, I think, is on discussion of Kashmir and the work of the Indian filmmaker Sanjay Kak, because there we really see the entanglement of psychoanalysis and ongoing colonial violence. But as ever, Ankhi's thinking about the relationship of psychoanalysis to colonialism is complex. She shows, for instance, that Freud sometimes places himself in the position of the colonizer and sometimes in the position of the colonized. And she suggests that psychoanalysis, ways in which psychoanalysis could be rehabilitated for the purpose of colonial interpretation. The final thing I wanted to mention, which is related to what I said already, is the contribution that the book makes to our understanding of migration and the migrant experience. And I was especially taken by the structure of Unseen City in the way it sort of enacts the procedures it describes. And that is because although the book focuses on three key cities, London, Mumbai, and New York, it repeatedly calls attention to the connections between these cities and many other places. As we move through the book and through these three cities, we also travel elsewhere, to Lagos, to Kashmir, for example, and more. The book also offers brilliant insights into psychogeography, the relationship of the psyche to space, to urban infrastructure, and to the psychic power of acts of walking, of wandering, of rambling. It's a book about psychoanalysis on the move, and it occurs to me that it's a book that also emerged out of movement in Ankhi's travels to the various free clinics that she studies. And so I want to end by asking Ankhi a question, I suppose, to do with the psychogeography of the migrant experience. So, Ankhi, of course, you're focusing on cities and on the kind of structure of the city itself. And so I suppose my question is, how would you characterize the psychogeography of the border? What do you see happening in sort of border zones? And a related question, I suppose, is, could you comment on your experience of travel and the fact that, as I said, you did write this book on the move through doing these empirical studies of free clinics? That's it for me for now.
Well, thank you very much, Natalya. Your opening remark about how extraordinary tutorials with Ankhi must be is, I think, will have resonated, because the breadth is extraordinary, including, as you say, the geographical reach. So I wonder if I now hand over to Ankhi to respond to those two sets of thoughts and also to answer Natalya's question and to go any way you want. So over to you, Ankhi.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. It's a daunting task to live up to, these extraordinary minds that, we had, that I've had the very good fortune of coming across in my life. I wanted to start by thanking you, Robert, for taking the time to not only host this but read the book, and for the great sort of hospitality and the home that is Wadham College, and Julie Haig and the development office. I want to thank all the alumni, the listeners, my colleagues and friends, my students who are here, because it's exactly the kind of environment that David mentioned, that is extremely conducive and productive of experimental thinking, of thinking outside the box. The box has to be comfortable for you to think outside the box sometimes, and it's a very sort of loving, nurturing home for me. So thank you. And I really wanted to thank Natalya and David for their extraordinarily. If this were a therapy session, I'd say they're returning my truth to me in words that I didn't realize. So there is definitely that sense of estrangement when I see these people whose teenage faces I remember. And sorry to sound patronizing here, it's not coming from a place of patronage, is coming from deep affection and respect. But I really feel that they are sort of really the readers I was writing this for. There's something that you asked me, Robert, and I want to start with that. You asked me what made me want to write on psychoanalysis in the first place. And I did my PhD on the history of hysteria in Victorian melodrama. And when that became a book, when it became a book called Aesthetic Hysteria, an uncle on my mother's side and an aunt on my father's side asked if the book was about them. So this is the kind of family background of emotion management that I come from, that I do think has had something to do with this idea of kind of occulted mental states, histrionic disorders, and of course Victorian melodrama was an extraordinarily interesting a kind of thing for me to read as a graduate student, both in terms of the kind of figurative language it used, and also in terms of emplotment, leading from this kind of the triple movement between the introduction of an emotional problem, the entertainment of the emotional problem, and then the cure, which often involved the murder of the hysteric or flinging her out of a window. So I was very interested in that. I almost became a psychoanalyst when I had a very difficult PhD, and I thought I'd train as a psychoanalyst. But around the same time that I was finishing my PhD, I also felt a disconnect, as if I simply did not. I was the wrong race, probably the wrong class, probably the wrong kind of gender to be participating in the discussions that were sort of galvanizing clinical psychoanalysis. And around this time, when I was kind of wondering, dwelling on my own ambivalence about psychoanalysis, I read about a wonderful book by Elizabeth Danto on the free clinic movement. This kind of culmination of the social democratic moment, where Freud is thinking about again. He defined psychoanalysis as a secular ministering of souls, and he's thinking about how necessary and how life-saving it is for the poor person. It's as life-saving as surgery, he says, in the kind of Budapest conference in 1918. And of course, this becomes a speech act, and free clinics become a kind of mental health cooperative movement. So I wanted to tell that story when I started writing this book. I thought I would talk about there is enough on what happened in Europe with the free clinic movement, but there wasn't enough about what happened in Latin America. There wasn't enough. At least I felt unsatisfied that there wasn't enough for how it went to India, or what was happening in New York. So I thought I would tell the stories of all the other places outside of Europe where the free clinic movement had traveled. But this is where something Natalya said about the traveling theory aspect of Unseen City, is it became a different book as I started on my kind of naive questioning of where is psychoanalysis in India. So in a way, to some extent, the book is also there as this Rolodex that take these contacts, if you will, and go and do better work than me. But I have tried to outline how I met each person along this journey. And this was a journey. It's not just a journey. It was a kind of very non-destinational journey, as we used to read on menus of Wagamama, non-destinational eating. It was very non-destinational. I didn't really know where the book would take me, but I was kind of started talking to anthropologists and urban geographers working on slums. Then someone said, I know this psychiatrist in Bangalore who was, a psychiatrist, not a psychoanalyst, but post his cancer treatment, he really believes in talk therapy. So this is how kind of, in a way, accidental, and this is how almost miraculous the connections were. And all I had was a set of questions. All I had was my close reading skills, my sort of in a way integrity as a scholar. And at every juncture, for every door I knocked, I expected a psychoanalyst or a psychiatrist to say, just go home, seriously, you have no idea what you're doing. But they didn't. And this is one of the things I wanted to kind of address, that I think in my questioning, they were also thinking, because most of the people I was talking to were community psychoanalysts, people who really wanted to do something. So they were, William Alanson White Institute, this wonderful institute on the Upper West Side, trained psychoanalysts who wanted to go into Harlem, or they were, trained by the Indian Psychoanalytic Institute and wanted to go into the field of, mental health rights as human rights, or they were Tavistock trained, psychotherapists who were trying to really squeeze into the more evidence-based medicine protocols that were now encouraged instead of psychoanalysis. So these short-term CBT type treatments, they were trying to, in a way, coax into these kind of short-term models more interpretive paradigms, longer time, longer sort of in a way kind of a concatenation of cause and effect. And so it's I want to kind of really take now kind of address some of the things that David said and Natalya said. I will keep this short because I'm dying to hear your questions, but I just wanted to give you this kind of background to Unseen City. One of the first readers of the book said that it felt like it was cinematic, and I don't think it was meant as a compliment. It simply meant that I had kind of really lost my marbles and I was kind of rambling a bit. But to some extent, that is a good characterization, that I was being led by the evidence, I was being led by the truth of the stories. I did not exactly have an agenda with the book. I did not think I was going to write about the psychoanalysis of the poor. I mean, I come from a country where the inequality is such that to call somebody a poor is almost a curse. It's almost to say you are the deficit model, you did not work hard enough, or you are not, I mean, so it's sort of, even the very term carries opprobrium, and I don't think that's what I set out to do. I want to kind of pick up on some of the things that and that David said, and these are extraordinarily nuanced comments. I mean, I'm a huge admirer of David's own work on psychoanalysis, and one of the things he said about the setting of psychoanalysis, and you're absolutely right that I was actually kind of coming to it from Freud, not so much Winnicott. The Winnicott was extraordinarily helpful for understanding the horticultural project, but that was kind of my question, that, and this is something Anlin Cheng says in her book Melancholy of Race, that it's not so much a question of why we can use psychoanalysis, but why we already do. Why do we use psychoanalysis? And one of the answers she gives is that it's not just because it's not just because it's political, not just because it came up in anti-Semitic, or as I said, social democratic Vienna, but because it's also sort of very good at understanding that the dynamics of the individual in relation to class, race, gender, the colonial imagination, etc. It's very good on the intrasubjective, what I call different circuits of transference, and it's kind of in a way haunted by history. So for me, I mean, this work from time to time, I had to really sort of go home and scream, because you simply feel, do I stop coloring my hair? Do I stop buying a nice bag? Do I give away all my money because the kinds of iniquity you see at that intersection of poverty and mental health is something that makes you question the tremendous sort of kind of network of privileges that brought me to write the book there in the first place. And to some extent, I really felt that in The Garden, for instance, that that David mentioned, this is St. Mary's Garden in Hackney, where a couple of Turkish psychotherapists, they do a horticultural therapy with women who have no English and who have been shunted from GP to GP simply because they were not able to articulate their problems. And here, these women whose past is, they were daily wage laborers in Turkey, and their language is primarily transactional. They find their kind of purpose in kind of working with their hands, growing crops, cooking them, in wiping away another person's tear, or kind of like finding some sort of community. So I really found this beautiful sort of, in a way, coming to terms with history. And this, I felt that beautiful garden was haunted by history, much as psychoanalysis is. And it was really showing us ways in which, this kind of sustained, kind of attention to another person's cultivation of self could happen, cultivation both in the horticultural sense, but also in the psychoanalytic sense. And it could happen without words. So it's not the usual, talking shop that we see. So this is a peculiar and a very singular setting of psychoanalysis where the talking shop is happening without words. And to kind of, in a way, go back to Natalya's, and this is something I feel that, one of the states I talk about, Natalya mentioned, the kind of, the formal attention, the paratactic phrases that I note in Boo. And I do think that to some extent in the Aminata Fauna chapter, I described this kind of 19th century dissociative disorder called the fugue state. 18th, 19th centuries, Charles Dickens was very taken by it. There are lots of kind of, novels that have these fugue or in-between states. I think my mode of writing the book was a fugue state, where I was kind of, constantly negotiating the penumbra of my own ignorance about, as I said, what I call the psychic lives. And I was ignorance because, to some extent, really, we are all products of, that understanding of poverty. And this is something George Simmel said in 1965, that poverty is a social relationship. It's not merely the lack of material means. We need the poor to be there for ourselves to feel middle class, or for ourselves to feel affluent, or for ourselves to feel like the philanthropist, or the, to occasion top-down charity. So I really forced myself to go into that kind of not a telescopic vision, not the bird's eye view, not the, the estate developers kind of, view from the top of the skyscraper, but a paratactic view. And these fugue states, these in-between states between knowing and unknowing, and also unlearning. So I really hope, if that has come across in my book, I'm very happy, because that's kind of where that's one of the main ways in which I wanted to kind of really depict, these cities with all their homeless and homesick populations. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ankhi. Can I, at this point, we've got a few minutes for questions. So invite anyone, please, to either put a question in the chat, or to raise your hand, your virtual yellow hand, or your real hand, whichever you prefer. And Ankhi is very happy, and I know Natalya and David too, to take questions on anything actually to do with English in Oxford. So it might be about Ankhi's other work on the curriculum and colonialism, and anything you want to ask about, or Natalya's work, or David's. So please don't feel you have to ask about anything in particular. But we should start with where you finished, Ankhi. And I just wanted to ask a question. I mean, you already touched on why psychoanalysis and your passion for it. You mentioned the college at the start as a kind of the box in which you were able to develop this. I'm very interested because, and the fugue state's not something I'm very familiar with, and I thought that is a wonderful concept. With the kind of stream of consciousness side to this book, cinematic, as you said. What strikes me from our history is it's impossible when you read the book to tell, unless you know already, what discipline you're in, actually, which is wonderful. Actually, it's a sort of multidisciplinary approach to life, which without boundaries, which I thought was wonderful and very inspiring. The second thing about it for me was the extraordinary sense of social mission and passion. You don't necessarily expect in a work on English literature your advocacy for psychoanalysis, for example, in a certain type of psychoanalysis, and your approach to social justice and poverty, as you just mentioned. I wonder, I don't know whether you responded to all that, but I think on the mission side of this, do you see your role as a professor of English to change the world, to have an impact? I mean, I don't mean that trivially. I mean, do you see it as compatible with your academic life to try to change things?
I mean, I definitely want the humanities to be invited to the table. I think we have a lot to contribute to this. And this is, I mean, in a way, and I don't want to say this that I'm some sort of a handboy to history, so I'm simply like a good scribe to everything I have seen, and I can write it in pretty language. But I do think, the way in which we see connections and the way we build on to connections, the way in which we create, sort of critical matter, which we call interpretation, that gap between the kind of the subject of enunciation and the world, we are good about closing that gap. So I really thought that in this book, I could kind of say that, look, this is something, I'm part kind of ethnographer, primarily literary critic, cultural critic, a part cinema goer, a part somebody who's suffering from incurable guilt about being born middle class, affluent in India. So I mean, I brought all those aspects, and probably because it's my third book, I was privileged enough to be able to take those risks. And I just want to say that this is a book for, in a way, the kind of Indianness, which I often forget about, came forth in the sense that, what I saw with the free clinics in India was how incredibly minded they were toward the idea of rehabilitation. So, one of the free clinics I talk about is called Samadhana, which means solution. And there are elaborate case studies, but one of the first things that happens to a woman whose maladies are associated with her incontinence as an adult. So she doesn't have this problem, but something happens in her adult life and she becomes very, very incontinent. And of course, the therapist, takes her through the vicissitudes of everything in her life that has led to that. But one of the first things the therapist says that don't drink a lot of water before you have to travel. And this kind of, bloody-mindedness is something I really love about, because this is exactly what I mean, that treat this person as a human, and treat, do not talk down, but talk, at kind of, in a way, rehabilitate them into kind of small talk. And this is one of the ways in which you can, and of course that's not the, as we know, that it's not as simple as that, but the fact that it starts with that kind of a very kind of, in a way, manageable solution makes the patient feel that they are, it'll make them feel there's an uncle or an Indian mother saying it, don't drink so much water before you travel. But it's kind of, again, not kind of pathologizing them, but kind of, in a way, reintegrating them into certain social circuits and social kind of social behaviors. And that's something I think that really I connected to that bit of me, and I saw that in the horticultural therapy. I saw that in the homeless shelter I worked with in New York, that in a way, most of these sort of vigilante activists, they were extremely matter of fact, and they're very solution minded. One of them said to me, we don't, analyzing the dream of the Red Bull. It didn't go into the book, but, and they say we don't go into the childhood because there is no time. And I really love that. I love that we don't have time to go into childhood. A farmer has come spending very hard-earned money to buying a ticket to Bangalore from the neighboring village, and I just want them to have some sense. So the Red Bull is not about some Oedipal anxiety. The therapist says, do you think you're worried about your daughter's death, where you have daughter's marriage, where you have to pay dowry? And the farmer says, yes, I'm worried about crop failures, I'm worried about, and the problem goes away momentarily. It'll probably come back again, but it goes away momentarily because there's some sort of a provisional solution that is offered with a view to restoring him to capability and to his active life.
Thank you very much, Ankhi. I'm going to just remind everyone, please do put your questions in the chat or put your hand up. But in the meantime, I will pass back to Natalya and David. And do you want to carry on the conversation if you like? Maybe Natalya, if you want to go first.
Sure. So I suppose, yeah, just another question about your experience of actually sort of doing the research for this book and sort of doing empirical research as someone who's trained as a literary critic. And I just wondered, yeah, how did you prepare for that? Did you not prepare much at all? Because I think, in the book you talk very interestingly about the sort of improvisatory nature of your research, and you talked about it earlier as well. But did you spend talking to social scientists, for example, or kind of habituating yourself in the kind of codes and conventions of empirical work, I suppose, is the question.
That's a fantastic question. And yes, I mean, to some extent, the closest discipline to the kind of the somewhat deranged thing I've done in Unseen City is, of course, kind of medical anthropology or ethnography. And I did read a lot of those books, but I also, what I did was when it went to the press, which is a very academic press, Cambridge University Press, I requested my editor to kind of, try and give it to psychoanalysts. So the book was read by 2 psychoanalysts, including Neil Altman, who is actually a great sort of a hero of mine. He wrote a book called Analyst in the Inner City. So, and I really wanted them to pull me up for, in a way, places where the method had glitched or the method wasn't really, kind of, very clear. I also kind of, for a lot of the case studies, especially the ones that were, there is a section on Nalam, which is a village project, that I, with the Banyan, it's a mental health charity in Chennai. I wrote up the case studies and then I made them reread it because I just wanted to make absolutely sure I was capturing. And one of the things, as you know, if you have any kind of grant, you can't really interview psychosocially disabled people directly. So you have to do that through the mediation of, an NGO, through psychotherapists, through social workers. And really that was a fantastic learning curve for me, not just talking to, the Western educated psychoanalysts and psychiatrists, but, what in India are called the barefoot researchers, people who are there, who are coming out of the municipality, kind of in the corporation system, and they're volunteers and they are being trained by psychiatrists to go back. And this is something, David, you mentioned, the idea of kind of no retribution. So they're trained in sort of non-judgmental listening, and then they go there and they become, this Indian psychoanalyst calls them vulnerable experts. And it was extraordinary for me to then interview them and learn about how tough their lives have been, which made them want to work in mental health in the first place. So, I mean, those were the tremendously interesting, sort of like almost excursive movements that the book kind of, allowed me to do, where I was not just kind of interacting with psychiatrists and psychoanalysts who speak my language, but also with these community, the lay, counselors who were and who were extremely, who said that this is our livelihood. They are not doing it for charity. They're doing it in that admixture of redressing certain social injustices they had felt themselves, but also, because they really felt that this is, this is a kind of a wonderful way. They call it Moner Kotha, this kind of almost this relay of knowledge, and they're so incredibly ingenious in getting stories. So if there is a woman who says she has some mental illness, but the family is very conservative, they put leaflets through the door saying, if these are your symptoms, maybe this is what you have. Then they send somebody from the community into the woman's house, a woman from that community into that woman's house, and they have a little sort of kiosk on the terrace of the house. And these kind of like, thinking on the feet, talking about traveling therapy, thinking on the feet, this ingeniousness through which some kind of cure is achieved. I mean, I just thought, this is it. I call it, this is in India, you have this word jugaad. It just means, these hacks. They're not cheating hacks, but in the absence of resources, these hacks that you come up with. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I have the thought of the kiosk outside people's doors, sort of being at the threshold. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Natalya. David, over to you.
Or just brief, you just picking up on the hacks. I mean, what these vignettes about these free clinics were so wonderful, because they showed you sort of people taking on the care of other people when there was no real infrastructure or resources to do it. And it is a side of psychoanalysis that actually gets underplayed. In that, I remember you reminded me of there's a story about Isaiah Berlin going to visit Freud at the end of his life, and he goes to see the great man, the great sage with his special language, and he comes away saying, well, he was just like the doctors who I had when I was a kid. I'd go and see and they'd just say practical, helpful things. And there is that side to psychoanalysis. Also, you've got to look after the frame of their life, just the ordinary, practical details that show a kind of care before or as well as getting to the sort of complicated, theoretical, rarefied ideas. So to bring that picture of psychoanalysis back, which was there right from the start in Freud, is a really important thing to do, and to show it working successfully in, as successful as people can do, given the conditions they're working under in these cases, in so many different contexts, is really inspiring. Because the question the book asks, I think, is, if you took a lead from all these incidents across the world and thought, what if we built our social healthcare system? What if we built a mental healthcare system based on these kinds of practical things that work? What would our system look like? It's a great question to ask.
No, thank you so much. And also, this is the other meaning of psychoanalysis, that it's, of course, you may understand it to have its traffic is with internal psychic conflict, but in the process, it also bestows, interiority. Talking about the dreams of the farmer who's unable to function. Again, that cultivation of interior life, and that's something I think is extraordinarily important for the two, sides of unseen that Natalya mentioned, that, it's both kind of this obliviousness, but also in kind of, countries very, very uneven, and countries such as India, it's cultivated. I always give that example that, you are given the sea view room, but, what no one tells you is that you really have to ignore the blue tarpaulin covered slum view before your eye hits the waves in Mumbai. And we are very good at that, because you can't obviously function. You can't eat if you see like all these hungry children clamoring around your car, or just outside the restaurant. So this is, and so to some extent, I really think that cultivation of interiority, not thinking of poor populations as a collective, but also thinking about them individualized by this pathology, is something I wanted to, not kind of like, really the mark of the plural. This is what Albert Memmi says, that people who have race, they have the mark of the plural, they're all the same. And here it's exactly the opposite of what I'm arguing.
Okay, there are two great questions actually in the chat, and one from Alec Burma. I apologize if I've got the pronunciation wrong. But apart from a lovely tribute to the book itself, which I'll leave you to read, but she says, to pursue a third, I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the place of the city in the book. Have you discovered more about the city as a venue, filter, enabling or disabling place for psychoanalysis as a practice? Because you also went to some rural areas in addition. So something about the city is.
Yes, thank you very much, Alaka. These are wonderful friends and faculty colleagues of mine. Yes, that was kind of one of the very interesting I think moments of reckoning for me, that I would have to take a certain amount of thinking about the primitive and poor in the world and translate it to poor in the city, because there's a lot of thinking around the figure of the primitive, and the in psychoanalysis, the reason I chose the city was very matter of fact, really, because I did not want to, you cannot, going from Oxford with straightened hair, you can't just jump into slums and start talking to, people about mental illness. You have to go through experts, and you have to take the right permission. So one of the key reasons I chose cities is because there are many, both public sector mental hospitals, public sector mental health hospitals, and also NGOs that work on poverty, that would give me the inroads into this. The other very important thing about the city is that, I mean, of course, New York, I mean, where I talk about the torture program at the Bellevue, I mean, of course, it could only happen in New York that, you have sort of, escapees from Bangladesh and slaves from Mauritania and the Rohingyas assembled in a New York hospital. So it is that kind of a kind of an asylum, and to look at again the different ways in which torture, in that sense, torture and that temporal lag we associate with trauma, that trauma is never, Freud's model was kind of, let's say, a railway accident, the railway spine, that something happens to you, you're on the railway for the first time, you have a railway accident, your body has never known this, so it takes you a little while to acknowledge what exactly has happened to you. So there's that temporal lag for people, who've come with half of their arm chopped up in a civil war. But there's also that element of unspeakability, that you cannot talk about what happened to you because you're the state, the person the perpetrator is somebody who will murder you if you talk about it. So there are these different ways in which the New York psychiatrist is having to then develop a panoply of psychotherapeutic methods to deal with not just the usual temporal lag of trauma, but these postcards coming from the dark places of the world, where unspeakability has that other dimension. So the city was extremely, in a way, important. I mean, I keep saying I'll never write a book like this because it was actually fairly physically exhausting, but I do want to write a book on Unseen Village as well. But I do think that the problems of mediation and translation will be even harder for me, because I never for a second forget how deracinated I am. I'm now away from India for 30 years, though I go back twice or thrice every year, but it's not the same thing. And I do think that I definitely want to go there, and I did a little bit of that with Nalam. So city, because city is where I had the psychiatrists and the psychoanalysts guiding me. City, because that's where the public sector mental hospitals are. City is also because you have these in the case of New York and London, I'm talking about migrant populations. So the migrant population at the torture center, migrant population at Tavistock, and finally city also because in India, the city is the place of the slum, this so-called liminal space, which is actually everywhere. It's not liminal, it's everywhere. It's not, the cities are kind of course they are zoned, but Dharavi, the biggest slum, it's in the center of the city, it's not in the edges, and it's the very sector that provides the kind of informal labor, kind of late liberal, late capitalist economy needs, but it's the very sector that is the most ignored. And I mean, in my book, with both Catherine Boo's work and with the work of Pukar, I've talked about non-registered slums. So these are squatter slums. So they are even worse than slums. And you don't have these in cities. So, to see this kind of resource deprivation where, so if it's a squatter slum, let's say somebody has occupied land belonging to the airport authority, then even the very basic, governmental responsibilities of providing water or electricity are not there. You don't need to do anything for them. So you can just leave them to their resources. So the city was kind of very vital to what I was doing here.
Thanks, Ankhi, and thank you very much, Elika. A slight variation from city versus rural to Lloyd Pratt's question. We just last 2 minutes really, and it's about significant national differences in the way that clinics or clinicians think about what constitutes a safe or safe enough space for good therapy to happen. I wonder if you could say something about that, Ankhi.
I mean, with the activists, thank you, Lloyd. Wonderful question. All the questions have been wonderful. One of the things that I'm saying is that there needs to be some sort of cultural or linguistic affinity for that safe space to be cultivated, especially with people who are brutalized by daily labor, brutalized by years in a deeply xenophobic, racist system. That in a way, the language, really kind of opens things up. If you look at my case studies of the Turkish migrants, for instance, they're also happy that they're able to talk to their therapist, who's a Tavistock trained therapist, in kind of in their own language. So and not just that, there is a kind of, in a way, Tagore quotation, "Opomane hote hobe shobar shoman," which means that in our degradation, in our abjection, we are all equal. So that's the other thing, that many of the people who work in the community, they talk about how they have suffered from mental illness themselves. So there is that kind of leveling. It's not the same thing at all, of course, for a middle class person to say, I have the same problems as somebody who's fled a particular extremely genocidal regime. But to say that, I know what it is to be rendered so vulnerable, and I had help, and therefore I'm paying it forward. So I do think for that safe space to happen, there has to be that kind of a, not top-down philanthropy, but that kind of almost a paratactic, not telescopic gesture toward creating equality, towards saying that we have to activate these relays, whether we call it transference, or the Bengali lay counselors call it moner kotha, like heart to heart. But that connection, we need to sort of in a way open our hearts for that other heart to be able to correspond to us with some life-giving beats.
Thank you, Ankhi. We're really out of time, but I just wanted to give one last sort of a minute each to Natalya and David, just a sort of final thought on the book. If you had to have your comment on the back cover, just leave us a thought on. There are plenty of glowing comments already, by the way, on the back cover, but a final 60 seconds from each of you would be great. So I don't know who wants to go first. Natalya, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, just to say, I was really blown away by it, really. I said in my brief comments, I was just so struck by the kind of deftness with which Ankhi is able to kind of bring together these seemingly quite disparate materials and texts and discourses and make them speak together so well. From talking about the kind of metaphors used in sort of theoretical writing on psychoanalysis, to sort of looking at entries in the DSM, to the interviews she does with practitioners of psychoanalysis. So I was just really impressed by that kind of bringing together various materials, and it just reminded me of how wonderful she is.
Thanks, Natalya. David.
Oh, and just my very brief comment on the back cover is this is the kind of psychoanalysis we need now.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's very much the flavor of the last hour. It is a wonderful book and a wonderful impact. So with that, can I give you 60 seconds, Ankhi, and then I must let people go and hand over to Julie, but any final thought from you?
Thank you very much. I'm kind of really very, there's a beautiful Rabindranath Tagore songs, and I was thinking about it when we had this effulgence of the last 2 days. It says, "Ei akashe amar mukti aloe aloe," and then it goes on to say, "Amar mukti dhulai dhulai." So it first starts saying, my freedom is in the skies, my freedom is in this light, and then it says, my freedom is in the dust. And I really, really would like that kind of dust biting aspect of knowledge and education to come through, that we've had our heads in the clouds for far too long. Let's try a little more of that dust biting, that dhulai dhulai, that kind of really trying to suspend personality and privilege, and trying to kind of in a way connect with these other kind of modes of knowledge, which are not charity, which are not sympathy or empathy, but which are much more hard won. That connection you have with the suffering of somebody whose lives you cannot possibly imagine or understand.
Thank you very much, Ankhi. Ankhi, a wonderfully inspiring place to finish. I'm going to thank you, Natalya, thank you, David, for taking the time for joining us to celebrate the launch of Ankhi's book, and thank you above all to all alumni all over the world for joining us, and for those who will watch this online in a slower time.